Welcome to Readings from Roberto, bringing you the wisdom and experience of Roberto Assagioli and Psychosynthesis through readings of his essays and lectures. We hope you enjoy this and gain a benefit that can be shared with others. Talks on the self, personal self, and transpersonal self by Roberto Assagioli. This is an edited version of selections from recorded conversations between Roberto Assagioli and some American students from the High Point Foundation over several days of July 1973 at the Assagioli summer residence in Italy. The conversation includes questions from students and answers from Roberto. Read by Jan Cunningham. Pauses and moments of silence in the sessions are not indicated in this reading. Identification with the self. The central subject is the self. This is an apt beginning of an initial identification, or affirmation of identity, with the self. It may seem strange that this central fact of our existence and our experience, the most immediate intimate awareness we have, is generally ignored, or even denied. I could say, spiritually it is a scandal, but psychologically it is quite understandable, owing to the extroverted direction of Western civilization. The final results we can observe all around us. And therefore, it is time, and perhaps in a sense the greatest service we can render, is to proclaim and celebrate the self. Of course, in the East, not the masses of course, but the enlightened minority has always realized that, and the Bhagavad Gita shows clearly and scientifically the distinction between the knower, the knowledge, and the field of knowledge. It seems obvious, let us say, spiritual common sense, that there could not be knowledge or a field of knowledge without the knower who knows it. And yet in the West, one speaks of knowledge without any awareness of a knower in ourselves or in others. I put this rather bluntly in order to show the situation and encourage change and the great task and service we all have in this respect. And as usual, as with peace in the world, let us begin with ourselves. The first thing is that each of us, and as a group, we realize vividly the reality of the self, because we are all mentally convinced of that, or we would not be here. But that is just the beginning. One might say it is like seeing the top of a mountain bathed in sun from the valley. And at least we know that it is a mountain, that there is a top, that there is a sun above it. But from the beginning, it is a challenge. So I cordially invite you to the adventure of climbing the mountain. Now it is clear, I repeat, all these things are known intellectually by you, but we have to help each other to realize them. And this realization is revolutionary, transforming, transfiguring. Even a clear mental notion of the task is helpful. The different stages of self-realization. Let us realize first that the realization of the self occurs up to different levels or octaves. First, at the personality level. We must realize that the appearance of the self does not begin at the top. It begins on the plane. It is a purely psychological experience, but it puts the firm foundation for all the rest. Giving the analogy, we will have to clear the field of consciousness, our personal consciousness, of all its contents, both so-called bad and so-called good. And sometimes the good contents may be more difficult to eliminate. Of course, if at first we can do it for 5 minutes, it is plenty. I would begin with 2 minutes, not to get discouraged, and then arrive to 5 or possibly more. It is more important to do it repeatedly for shorter periods than to do it with effort. So, do it repeatedly and even imperfectly. Get into the habit of shifting the self-awareness to the center. This is not a peak experience. So many at present crave for wonderful peak experiences, even with doubtful means, and they neglect the first step or level. Here there is another basic misunderstanding to eliminate. Here I might say the fault, or rather the cause, is not the blindness of our materialistic civilization, but the language used, both in the East and the West, such as destroy the self, destroy the ego, get rid of the ego, it's all illusion, and all that. That, of course, provokes a violent reaction from the personality. Apart from this emotional or mental resistance or opposition, it is simply not true. It is the mistake or confusion between the contents of the personality, between the identification with the contents, and the point of self-awareness. If we eliminate the content, we remain. The self remains. Pure self-awareness, not ecstatic, but it has in itself a sense of assurance, of inner certainty, security, permanence, which is already much. But it is a quiet, subtle thing. Therefore, all the assertions of there is no ego have to be qualified. What do you mean by ego? If you mean your whole personality, of course, most of that has to go. But if you mean the self, no. The point of self-awareness remains stable, immutable, permanent. This simple clarification, which I see from your faces you agree with, helps to get rid of a quantity of mistakes, of misunderstanding, of false attitudes and attempts. So, I think our first task is this, to clarify what I said. I invite you to do it on all occasions and all the time, beginning by yourselves. The self, a synthesizing center. This, if you like, can become the essence of personal psychosynthesis, because there cannot be a synthesis of elements without a synthesizing center. So I think that would be almost enough for today to have this very clear, but I go a step further. Why does the self at the personality level have this quality? Because it is the reflection of the higher self, of the transpersonal self, and it reflects, however pale, the same qualities of its source. If you look at the reflection of the sun in a mirror or on water, you see the light and quality of the sun, infinitesimal, but still the quality of the sun. So that explains why even at the personality's level, the self is stable, sure, and indestructible. Here we enter into the field of what is called spiritual psychosynthesis. But as you know, lately the term transpersonal has been used, especially by Maslow, and I and others have adopted it because it is very apt. It is neutral. It can be accepted by anybody. It first means beyond the ordinary level, whatever it may be. But the word spiritual has various meanings, and some rather doubtful, and of course it arouses the opposition of all who are purely mental and intellectual. So it is much better to use the word transpersonal. William James said with humor that souls are out of fashion. In a sense, one has to rediscover an old truth, starting from scratch. So then we can give up the word soul in public. Disidentification, a prerequisite for the realization of the self. Question. Some people do not like the idea of saying, I have a body, but I am not the body, or other contents of consciousness. They feel this is a rejection. Answer. That is one of the many misunderstandings which are consequences of the central misunderstanding. No rejection at all, but put things in their place. No reason. St. Francis knew better. He called his body brother ass, in a benevolent attitude. We need bodies here, and we ought to take care of them and appreciate them. It is not only mystics or religious people who do not have the right concept, but also intellectuals who neglect their body, have no sense of their body, who do not experience it, and are not even aware of it. So we have to fully appreciate the body without making any mistake to say, I am it. That's the difference. I can appreciate an apple, but I am not the apple. We can appreciate many things without being them. So we appreciate our body, make good use of it, and asking forgiveness for the sins we commit against it, without saying, I am that. It seems obvious. There is an explanation for that mistake. At present, for many people, it is the body that has them. They are slaves of their body. So, as a first reaction, perhaps a separative stage is needed psychologically, not spiritually. We may have to go to the other extreme for a little while in order to reach it. And that is true for every kind of possession. We must realize that we are possessed all the time, even obsessed by all the conditioning of our background and current life. And also, what is called our material possessions. We do not possess them, they possess us. Those who are attached to money are possessed by money. They do not possess money. And so, for all the rest, it is not about not being possessed, but possessing in the right way, without attachment. But appreciate and use, also with money. The depreciation of money, the attack against money, is only a phase for false detachment. Money is divine substance crystallized. It is energy in a convenient form for handling. It all depends upon our inner attitude. 3 levels of self. Question: I am so grateful for being here. The self, the transpersonal, is a great step. It may take years, even a lifetime. Answer: oh yes, there is no end to the realization, from the personal to the transpersonal, from the transpersonal to the group self, from there to the universal self. So you can have a good time. Question: yesterday our group leader mentioned that often therapists are inclined to become perhaps overly involved and preoccupied with only the theoretical aspects of psychosynthesis, and subsequently put too little emphasis on the practical application of the psychosynthetic principles. Will you please explain some of the psychodynamic elements and/or causes which underlie this propensity? Answer: it is very true what you said, but that one could call the illusion or delusion of intellectualism. Again, intelligence is a wonderful thing, but the intellect should not possess us. We should try to be as intelligent as we can, and we can be more intelligent and use our intelligence, but not be possessed by it. And especially realize that any intellectual formulation or theory is merely a description, not a real thing. It is a question of semantics, you see. The map is not the territory. The map can be very useful, but generally they believe the description of a map is the territory. Therefore, I always insist in psychosynthesis that we shall think experientially, practically, pragmatically. No theory. There is no theory of psychosynthesis. It is an art, a method, an adventure, anything but a theory. Stick to that. Question: this is clear and good, referring to what was said about I am not my body. Glad to start at transpersonal level experience. One can say, I am more than my body, and so on. Answer: it is not starting at the transpersonal level. It is going toward it. One can say, I am more than the body, but I would not do, because that would say, I am also the body, but something more. But we are not the body at all. So better to be, I am not more than Brother Ass. I'm glad I could put very clearly the fundamentals of the whole structure. That talking point you can use in all your group meetings. It gets rid of so many troubles. Question: what self were you speaking of? Self with a small s or with a capital S? Answer: I spoke of the self in general, without specifying, because of the principle of a center of awareness, a living center of awareness at all levels, including both the personal self and the spiritual self, because essentially they are not separate, as I said, the analogy of the reflection of the source of light. We have to insist on the central fact that we are subjects, living subjects. Each human being is a living subject. So simple and so hard to realize. Always go back to that awareness. Realization. Another way of putting it, and this answers the question about doctrines and so on, you see in psychology and philosophy, and generally, we speak of will, love, mind, thought, and so on. But there ain't such a thing. there are only subjects who are willers, living beings who are lovers. The rest is only pure intellectual abstractions, useful for didactic purposes, but they don't exist very long. We have lovers, but there doesn't exist any entity called love, an entity called will, and I try to make clear in my book on the will, it's not a book about the will. The title is The Active Will, and an act presupposes an actor who performs acts of will. That is basic. Always remember that. It saves a lot of discussion and byways and further confusion. It is an existential attitude, the fact of entities, living beings, and that at all levels. So we first realize it at the personality level, which is good enough for the time being, but then we try to go back to the source of the reflection. So I go slowly to drive home 3 essential points. Then we can fly more. The transpersonal self. How about the transpersonal self? These are confused points and concepts. One speaks of, from the higher experiences, illumination, intuition, and all the other so-called cosmic consciousness and so on, as being the same. They are not. The basic difference is that all of these are processes, living processes. They belong to the world of becoming. And even at the transpersonal, there is this wonderful process of becoming, of growth, of all the phases of superconsciousness. But the self, in contradistinction, is stable, firm, permanent. To use the philosophical word, ontological. It is pure being. Pure being is not becoming, and becoming is not pure being. It needs the intuition to grasp this, or even the illuminated mind, but they are both together anyhow. Also on the higher, let us say the rational mind can see this difference, and many philosophers have pointed out the difference between being and becoming, process and entity. Well, that has been the wonderful intuition of Maslow, with the title of his book, Toward a Psychology of Being. Therefore, he has seen that when the end of our psychological search is where we shall be, but present psychology can only go towards it, as we can only go towards it. That gives me an occasion to advise you warmly to study Maslow, his basic books, and Towards a Psychology of Being, and the new one, The Farther Reaches of Human Nature. Maslow has been a great pioneer, opening the way, but he has not had the possibility of developing all that. He is beginning. He doesn't give the map, and he doesn't pretend to give it all. He is a pathfinder. He shows paths, and he has got rather far on some of them, but not to the end. And there are other paths. So, he's upon one and shows paths and signposts. The whole exploration practically has to be done in a systematic and scientific way. There are plenty of testimonials of experience, but not a general consistent map of the inner space. So, that's for all of us to go on and to do it. Let us feel the wonder of being pioneers along with others, with a growing minority of others. So, not only is the map not the territory, but at present there is not a map. In a sense, this is very good, for only a primitive map could create limitations. In a sense, we should be glad there is not a map, so it is our opportunity to trace it. Remember always, it is a map. Therefore, please study Maslow thoroughly. A special chapter in his last book, which was first published in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, is called The 32 Meanings of Transcendence. This is a perfect example of the dozens and dozens of meanings of the same word, and he courageously tackled this word, transcendence, which of course is not a matter for psychology yet. So, if you study Maslow, I can refer to that in the present and for the future, but it can be our good companion and guide up to a certain point in our explorations of the inner world. He, too, doesn't always make clear the distinction between being and peak experiences. It would be too much to ask him to give us the complete, perfect picture. He has given us so much. But while you read, be aware that he often doesn't make it very clear. Now you see how much the self implies. The confusion, the natural inevitable confusion at first between transpersonal experiences, peak experiences, and the self is very well illustrated by astronomy. We say currently that we see the sun, but we don't see the sun. We see the light emanated by the sun. It's something completely different. We don't see the sun. We don't know what the sun is behind the shining curtain of radiation, and the astronomers have lately realized that, and somebody gives, I don't remember who right now, but it's not important. If we look across the lake to the lights and lamps on the other shore, we naturally say we see the lamps, but we see nothing of the kind. The lamps are invisible. We see the light emanated by those bulbs, but we don't see the bulbs. So also at this level, we never see directly to the core, the source there, immovable, just radiating and shining. What you can see are the radiations that come from that. So all becoming is a radiation from being. Disidentification clears the content of consciousness. Question: is the clearing of the contents of the personality of both good and bad done by disidentification? Answer: of course, that is the deeper meaning of disidentification. All of what I have said this morning is a kind of comment and explanation of the basic fact of disidentification, and I repeat what I hinted yesterday. Sometimes it is harder work to disidentify from the so-called good points than from the so-called bad points, and on a higher level, from the so-called peak experiences. Question: how can we celebrate the self? Answer: also, here is a paradox. Essentially, we cannot celebrate the self except by being the self. But on the level of relativity, the personal self, the ego, the self, the reflection at the personality level, we can well celebrate the higher self. So, the personal self can celebrate the higher self. But when it is united with it, there is no more celebration. But as a means to approach it, to rise towards it, celebration is very useful to proclaim and celebrate the self. In the same sense, one can worship, in the good sense, the sun, without knowing it directly, but only through the radiation. You see, these are all different ways to say the same thing. Perhaps one could write about the 48 ways of seeing the sun. Anyhow, you can begin to relate them, and we'll see what we can do with them. Question: you said there can't be a synthesis of elements without a synthesizing center. This seems to be so central to our theme and to psychosynthesis. Could you please develop this a little more? Answer: well, of course, there cannot be anything without a nucleus, a core. There cannot be an atom without a core. There cannot be any living organism without a central life, with keeping the life organized for the purpose of permanence and growth. So, you have to say there is always inevitably a core. And what I have done is only to apply this specifically to the psychosynthesis of the human being, both at the personal and at the transpersonal levels. There could not be any order, any harmony, and real life of a personality without a synthesizing center. But the personality is not yet synthesized. That's the point. It is a constant dramatic interplay between subsidiary centers of subpersonalities or drives, or all kinds of contents of the personality, and the synthesizing center, which has such a hard time. But it is there, and however partial and unsatisfactory to a certain point in the so-called normal individual, it is a coordinating, bringing together element. Therefore, psychosynthesis, first, second, and third, is the working from the center. That center you see is synthesizing not in itself. I repeat, it is a static, pure being, but it acts. This is a paradox. Also another central point to realize, and then enough for today. The self radiates. Aristotle called it, in that fine paradox, the immovable mover. It is immovable, but sets in motion everything else. I suggest you meditate upon the immovable mover, and our center, the sun. That unknown, mysterious entity sends enormous radiation throughout our whole solar system and beyond. The self as a jewel. Also, a jewel as static. but sparkles. The jewel receives light and then reflects it and sends it back again. Or even a simple mirror reflects most of the light it receives, so it is not so difficult to realize this paradox of the immovable mover. These are points to ponder on first, and then to realize gradually for days, weeks, months, years, and decades. I suggest that for a few days we go on with a simple affirmation and realization of the self. We can do it a little longer today. How many minutes can you stand? 5, 7, 8? Not more. We'll use this timer with a bell. It's made to cook eggs, but we sublimate it and use it to set the time for meditation. This is an amusing example of how we can utilize all machinery for spiritual ends. Machines are indifferent. These cassette recorders led themselves to spiritual messages and to spying. It's all the same to a machine. Let us realize that. So there is no sense in barking against machines. But there are those who make foolish use of the machine. All, let us say, acquisition of a machine is a test to a false address. It should be to the sender. So, let us meditate. A rapid preparation with disidentification. Let us relax the body, asking it gently to keep quiet for 8 minutes. The same to the emotions, awareness but no activity. Now the troublesome mind, more difficult because we have been using it until 2 minutes ago, and it resents being ordered to go ahead full steam and then immediately to keep quiet. It has to be tamed. So let us ask our mind, you'll work all right later, but for now, keep quiet for 5 minutes. That is the way we need to talk to our various parts, in a kindly way, but firm. Now we have made some room, some space in consciousness. Let us affirm and proclaim. More radiant than the sun, purer than the snow, subtler than the ether is the self, the spirit within us. We are that self. That self are we. Let us try to realize it in a triumphant mood. That's a supreme truth, and it shall prevail. Do not fight the intruding elements coming from the body, emotions, and mind. Just try to neglect them. Not fight them actively, but keep them on the periphery of consciousness, so to speak. Bring back the awareness, the attention, to the radiant core, to the center. So let it be. Don't be discouraged because you didn't succeed. This is a training towards. Let us not have any illusion that we succeed. If not, it will go away, finish. So, just the beginning of training towards. Of course, we cannot keep quiet all our elements, but we have to begin. So, no discouragement at all. Just experience and elementary training is all that can be done at present, realistically. Don't ask too much of the personality. Question. You said will is not an entity, nor is love. Can one not just meditate on the will as an entity or a great life? Answer. But of course, there is an entity of love and an entity of will. What I meant is that there is not an abstract concept of love, not a theoretical concept or philosophical concept of will or love or so on. But they are great cosmic entities, planetary, solar, cosmic entities. All are entities. Finally, that great affirmation, space is an entity. So, of course, but entities in the sense that they are living, subjective, conscious beings. But when philosophers or psychologists discourse on love, they do not think of love as an entity. They think of a concept of love, a theoretical description of love. That is the distinction I wanted to make clear. There is no philosophical or psychological concept, a pure mental concept, just because they are living entities. So, au revoir. Have a good time with yourselves. Question. We would appreciate having also some more extended meditations guided by you, if possible. Answer. That will come, but His Majesty the Self first. You see, more long meditation must have some subject within it, but it's not for the self. But it will come. Question. In your discussion of the confusion between transcendental experiences, peak experiences, and the self, you gave us illustrations of the light from the sun and the lights emanating from the bulbs across the lake. In these illustrations, we see only two of the above aspects. Would you clarify these points for us, please? Answer. I don't quite see, but I'll sum up the matter. I mean, we never see the core, the center, only emanations from it. Just so, we don't know even what the core of the self is, but only the radiation. So, just the same, we never see the bulb and the spiral filament in the bulb across the lake. We only see the light. I think there's nothing more to say than that. The basic differences between the core and the radiation from the core are the essence of the self, being, and its rays and radiations. All our transpersonal experiences are experiences of radiations, qualities, energies of the self, but not of the self itself. Is that clear? Peak experiences. Question. What is the peak experience and where does it fit into the analogy? Answer. Peak experience is only a general term used by Maslow to indicate any kind of transpersonal experience, mystical, aesthetic, and so on. Anything of peak means height, an experience above the normal level of consciousness, or personal consciousness. Not something specific, just a general name for any kind of experience above the ordinary level. But when you study Maslow's book, you'll see. But essentially, it is this. I could say one thing, paradoxically, that the self cannot know itself because knowledge is a dualistic attitude, the knower and something known. But the self is. It needs not to know itself in a human way. It is being, pure being, essence. That, I think, makes it more and more clear. Now, I should like to add something about the celebration of the self. Somebody asked me to speak of the celebration of the self. I gave already the general answer concerning each of us. To celebrate the self is to become more and more aware that we are the self. But then there are more specific ways of celebration, especially for others. And I give you a formula, and then I'll comment on it. To proclaim and celebrate the self in thought and word and deed, in life and death. This requires comment, especially the last sentence. In thought is just what we are doing. To realize also mentally, as much as possible, as little as possible, something of the essence of what the self is. And in meditation, a vital meditation on the self is to proclaim and celebrate it in thought. In word is just what I'm doing and what you will do, and what you are invited to do when you go back home on every possible occasion. Both spoken and written work, so to speak, may I suggest, are champions of the self, because a more difficult thing to do is to proclaim it in deed. You can start by the constant use of the as-if technique. Let us try to be as much as possible as if we were identified with the self. And after the visual preparation, imagine ourselves identified with the self, how we would behave in different situations. So, very simple to understand, not so simple to do it. Now, in life and death. From the transpersonal standpoint, life is out of the body. The transpersonal that is not in the body. One of those, another life in the body, is considered as a prison or the death for the soul. More exactly, for that fragment of the free soul which chooses to incarnate, to limit itself, to die symbolically to its plane of joy and freedom, and to be embedded in matter. For life is a joyous proclamation of the true life of the soul. So when we say, in life and death, we are to think life and death. So you can use all this in your work on the self and with others. Subpersonalities. Question. I'm wondering if you will please assist us by talking a bit about subpersonalities, and if they are a part of the reflection of self. Also, how the self is apprehended. Answer. I think it is good to speak about the subpersonalities because it is an essential technique, and not all have a clear idea about them. Subpersonalities can be considered in two ways. In a general way, One might say that as the sun reflects itself in countless mirrors, so the self can reflect itself not only in the one central personal ego, but also in others. It is difficult to realize, but each subpersonality that is developed enough to have a will, to be consistent, to think, and to feel, is a miniature personality, and has the same qualities of the general personality. A subpersonality is a small personality on its own that would live in rather deep water. There is the principle of personification, but I will not go into that because it is more theoretical, and I abhor theory. But after all, it is not a theory. It is a process of personification. Every psychological element, especially every group of psychological elements, for example, those that in psychology are called complexes, tend to personify themselves. Up to this point, it is not a theory. We can observe that. Let us take the simplest example, the roles. A woman often identifies herself with her motherly function to the point that she feels and acts chiefly as a mother. So that is a subpersonality on its own, which may be in conflict with the feminine traits. One of the subjects of practical importance, and I don't go into that now, is the conflict between the wife role and the mother role. We may take this up another day, but it shows that each subpersonality has a kind of ego. Now, I'll just mention a theoretical question. One could conceive a subpersonality as a direct reflection of the self, as I said, of the higher self, or as a second reflection of the ego. The first, perhaps, is more correct to say metaphysically, but the second is more useful for practical purposes in education and in therapy, because that helps to reabsorb each subpersonality into the integrating personality. So, for purposes of psychosynthesis, self-actualization, education, and therapy, it is better to adopt this, which is true as far as it goes. It happens. One can reabsorb and, let us say, put down a role, a subpersonality, through each function of the role. It's very difficult if one says, I am the mother, or instead one says, I play now the role of the mother as well as I can. That makes a difference. Then the mother is now no more independent, self-asserting, and so on, but it is a subsidiary role of the whole personality. That makes all the difference, practically. It can also be expressed in terms of disidentification. Disidentification means putting at the right place every element and role and subpersonality. So it is not abolishing, not criticizing, nothing of the kind. It is giving to each its proper position and function, under the guidance of the personal self first, and eventually the higher self, or the two combined. So the different approaches complete each other at various sides. But this is one of the most practical approaches, if we only remember it. It is easy to understand, and easier to forget. Now, awareness. I speak much of awareness. Awareness is just this. To be aware all the time is not pure awareness or something transcendent. There is that, of course. But the first awareness is to be aware of the interplay of the factors in the personality. I present these points on purpose in a non-systematic way, just answering the needs of the moment, because it is more direct, more vital. Then it is up to you to put order into this madness. So it gives you something to do. It is better also in your work to never give things ready-made on a plate. Just give them the ingredients and say, you cook them. And most like that. Needs cooperation and their own work and all that. And those who won't take the trouble, they simply aren't ripe. Let them go and play and swear. So you see how your comments tickle me. You give me an occasion to say some things. Question. Does this process, though, mean that the personality is becoming what? Integrated, synthesized, actualized? Is a radiation of the self's being? Does it mean that the self's becoming is a radiation of the soul's being? Answer. That shows how very difficult it is to become aware of these things. They appear simple, but it is difficult. I quite appreciate it. If you find it too easy, I would be doubtful. Of course, the personality is becoming. Becoming what? Integrated, yes, Synthesized, yes. Actualized, yes. Is a radiation of the self's being, yes. The integrating factor in the personality is the personal ego self, the reflection of the higher self or soul or transpersonal self. Without that integrating, synthesizing factor, there could be no real personality, no integration. This has been expressed well as, in a sense, is an aspect of the universal law of syntropy. Physicists up to recent times spoke as if there was entropy only, that is, the degradation of energy until everything was dead. A very tragic picture, fortunately completely false. Now they have discovered, with the new research, and both in subatomics, physics, and astronomy, that there is indeed a process of syntropy, of increasing the potential, the tension. This is what Teilhard de Chardin calls the omega point. So it has been demonstrated as a reality. In a sense, only in a sense, it could be considered as an aspect of the law of gravity, of attracting towards the center. But in motion and becoming, especially in rapid motion, there is the other tendency of dissipation, of spreading. So the life, both cosmic and individual, is a fine balance, or should be a fine balance, between the tendency to concentration and to diffusion. If there was only concentration, death would ensue. If there was only diffusion, also. To repeat, we can always observe in empirical experience that there are two trends, the trend to concentration and the trend to dispersion. Introvert, extrovert, and ambivert. Partially, it corresponds to introversion and extroversion. And as in personality integration and psychosynthesis, the aim is ambiversion, that is, being able to alternate extroversion and introversion from a higher point of awareness. It is the self, even at the personality level, which through the regulating function of the will, the directive regulative function of the will, can balance the alternation of extroversion and introversion according to needs, opportunities, and tasks. This is the personal, simple, let us say, manifestation of the cosmic love, of the balancing between gravitation and expansion. Is that clear? Question: could you say something of the ambivert? Is there a personality type indicating integration and ambiversion? Answer: I'm going to give you the appendix from my book on the will, on differential psychology. There I made it clear that in a sense there are no fixed types. Introvert, extrovert, etc. are not labels. They simply mean a direction of the life interest. That is a process, not something static. Therefore, we should not label either ourselves or anybody as extroverts or introverts. And we do that all the time, and it is a limiting label. Fortunately, there is no 100% introvert. Or he would perhaps be a severe psychotic, or a 100% extrovert. Although many modern men, businessmen, etc., get dangerously near to being 100% extroverts. But happily they cannot reach it, and then some crisis comes in and beneficially pulls them back. Therefore, introversion, extroversion, and ambiversion are just temporary conditions, or I might say, percentages of the flow of energy. Also, biologically, while we are asleep, we are biologically introverted, but many activities go on, and when we are very active physically, emotionally, in gymnastics or sports, we are physically extroverted. So, at all levels, it is a momentary direction of the greatest percentage of vital, psychological, and spiritual energy. So, no labels, but just an existential condition which changes anyhow, and which we can take in hand and direct. Of course, at best, someone who has an integrated personality has the power to be ambivert at will. They can be one of the two at will. Question: are the terms individual soul and group soul just terms, since all is one? Do we have to experience individual, then group, on the way to be one? Answer: now, that gives me an opportunity to take up another essential point of psychosynthesis, that of the various levels of reality. There are various levels of reality, or if you like a modern term, energy fields. Each has its own qualities and laws. For instance, certain chemical laws at the atomic level are no more valid at the subatomic level, but they are not abolished, not superseded. Only at the other level, other laws work. Here comes a jump, leaving aside intermediate steps, which you can find out. All is one is a deep metaphysical truth at that level. But unfortunately, many bring down that wonderful reality at human levels, or other levels in manifestation, where it simply does not operate. And many of the so-called metaphysical movements or special movements, and also some Oriental approaches, don't take into consideration the basic difference. All is one in essence, in being, but in becoming, in manifestation, in that process of life, there are countless many. I don't enter in that problem. All life is one has chosen to reflect itself in countless many. If he did it, we may surmise he had very good reasons, but it is his business, not ours. What we can say is that the great process of involution culminated in the mineral, as far as we know, and then started the contrary movement or process of evolution. We perhaps optimistically can say that we are at the middle point. We have passed through the mineral, vegetable, animal, and partially human. So we have to proceed in this evolutionary work towards the one, but it is still far off. And here comes the confusion between the two selves, which creates so much mischief. When we say, I am that self, quite true, but we are not that in daily life at all. That would be paranoia. I have written, some paranoiacs just take that literally, and when they have a glimpse, they think they're God. So you see, all this fits with the levels of reality. Now, you can work it out nicely with your active mind. Write something on it. It can do much good, and make the other a talking point. Shall we have the meditation 10 minutes today? So we can increase it every day, every time 2 minutes. Have you time? Of course, if you have the time, it is better. For a few days, let us stick to the self, pure and simple. That's a good phrase with meaning, pure and simple. And here he sets the timer for 10 minutes. The egg starts cooking. We can jokingly say it's a question of the condensation of the yolk, or the core. But also, with self, we can use each day for a moment. First, a rapid recollection of the personal self, quieting as much as possible in a short time, relaxing the body, quieting the emotions, asking the mind to be so good as to keep still. And then, in the measure we succeed in doing that, the elastic pull, the thread between the personal self and the transpersonal self, the soul, can be considered as being elastic, and a good elastic. And when all the things which tie the personal self to the ordinary level are eliminated in a measure, the pull continually operates, and the personal self is drawn joyously upward toward the self. In silence, let us try as much as possible to go close to the self, without strain or anxiety, but calmly, joyously, and easily, helped by a central affirmation. More radiant than the sun, purer than the snow, subtler than the ether, is the self, the spirit within us. Let us affirm triumphantly, we are that self are we. Try to realize it in the silence. So let it be. I thought it was advisable to give you a short period of respite from the self. Of course, I mean the direct attempt to recognize it, which is something rather strenuous, and therefore if you succeed it may bring in too much energy, more than you can cope with. So I give you a vacation from that, not for long, and instead I alternate with some psychosynthesis. I shall just say something, but I will say more some other time, about keeping the clear distinction between psychosynthesis and psychology in general, including the transpersonal. You know about it, but it should always be kept in mind. There are two quite different languages, so we have the privilege of being polyglots, of being able to use both languages. But we should not impose on others a language which they do not know. It is not easy because the temptation all the time is to slip in some matter. I'll tell you by and by how to translate from one language into another. Anyhow, let us say the basic thing is self and soul. So, advanced psychology accepts the self, but doesn't like to call it the soul. It's all right. So by and by we'll make a little dictionary of the different ways of saying the same thing in the two languages. It will be useful. Question: You have spoken so much of the self. I have been pondering these last few days on the distinction between the self and the mind. I'm a little confused. If you can bear with me for a moment, I would just like to ask this. Is the mind, the self, at a peculiar level of evolutionary development? Or is the mind but the vehicle of the center of pure self-awareness of the self being lifted onto the mental plane, the plane of mind? The mind is a creative organ, it seems to me. Therefore, it is not simply a vehicle until the point of self-awareness has been raised onto a higher level so that it can impress the mind from a superconscious or abstract level with its will and purpose. Therefore, through deductive reasoning, the mind, in my estimation, is a creative, active, energizing organ with a conscious I. The point of self-awareness has been shifted consciously by the will into a higher psychological or spiritual center. In other words, when is the mind a vehicle for the self, and when is it the self itself manifesting through its qualities and the field of energy? Answer: This I answer in purely psychological language, because it can be done. Then you can translate it. Or after due pause, I can say something in the other inner language. Well, the mind, to put it in an extreme way, has nothing to do with the self. Animals have some mentality. Sometimes they are cunning and intelligent. This apart from the fact that there is an intelligent mind in our life and so on. But that has nothing to do with the self. The mind can function at different levels, independently of the self. The mind is really an instrument in the higher sense. In the sense, we can psychologically distinguish the concrete mind, we call it the lower mind, and the higher mind, which is reason, nous in Greek. But psychologically one can say there is the analytical mind, the concrete mind, scientific mind, and on another level there is the philosophical mind, which deals with the universal, let us say like Kant, Plato, and so on. But that has nothing to do with the self. There are very intelligent philosophers who deny or ignore the self. You say the mind is creative. In a sense, an instrument can be a creative organ. It is creative in its own way. The processes of the mind, induction and deduction, are creative. Moreover, the mind is often associated with imagination and with feeling, sometimes with intuition, so their combination is distinctly creative, but has nothing to do with the self. Is this clear? The self is a completely different dimension. The self is a completely different dimension. There is a mathematical term, incommensurable. The self is incommensurable to any other dimension of the psyche. I think I made it clear. It is good to clear this point because for everybody present and for all those you will teach and treat, it is part of everything. I put everything in its own place. That doesn't mean complete separation, but clear distinction of functions. See? Question: But is not the soul, the self, an entity on the mental level? Answer: It can be said on simple terms. We have to distinguish the mental level, that is, the mental world, which is a distinct level of reality from any mind functioning in it. The mental stuff is mind stuff. You can call it the collective unconscious or the mental level of the unconscious, but it is something impersonal, a kind of substance of that level. There, in that world, dwell and act countless entities of different kinds. But the entity is not the stuff, not the material. It dwells there. Is that clear? So, it is the mental world composed of mental stuff that enables all kinds of entities to function there. The jewel in the lotus. Question: So the soul is not made of mental substance. Answer. The term soul is an ambiguous term and can be used in different ways, and it is good to have that clear. If we take the soul in a general way, it is made of, or it comprises, the causal body, the egoic lotus, which is composed of several streams of qualified mental energy. But at the center there is the jewel, the spark, the divine immortal center. Very often confusion is made because one doesn't distinguish well the two. There are many things one can say. Many things I can say of the soul in general that don't apply to the jewel, and the jewel is not of mental stuff. It is a divine spark projected into the mental level, where it collects itself in various mental energies composed of the petals. Therefore, there are certain more or less paradoxical expressions, such as the soul disappears. What disappears are the streams of energy which compose the causal body, and then the spark is freed to return to its source. We'd better always qualify that, because when the soul disappears, you see in what sense? Here we come back to the self, the whole question of anatta, non-atta, not self. All that applies to the composite soul in time and space, made of the energies and the spark, but not of the spark. Question. For purposes of interpreting terminology in psychological terms in psychosynthesis, then you are saying the mental plane is what is called in psychosynthesis the field of consciousness, the soul, conscious I, and thoughts, feelings, act, the psychological elements in that field? Answer. No. The mental plane is much larger than the field of consciousness. It includes all the mental aspects of the unconscious. The whole unconscious has mental quality. Instead, the field of consciousness is a little circle. Then the conscious I is not the soul. We can call it a projection of the soul in the field of consciousness. Just as a spark is projected into the higher mental, the causal, so a secondary projection goes from the higher mental to the lower middle mental. So we can say in psychological terms that the field of consciousness is the circle. The point in the center of the field is the normal I awareness. Self-awareness of the psychologists, and thoughts, feelings, etc., are psychological elements which exist in the field of consciousness and outside of it, and there is a constant entering and going away from the field of consciousness. It is our steeplechase, sending them away from the field of consciousness. I think I made that clear too. I really think that my most useful function is to clarify these fundamental points and suggest the right terminology, because then you can make yourself all the application when the starting point is clear. Question. When a person who goes out of the body without intention or control through some form of meditation, how can we help him to be grounded? Answer. Well, the immediate help may be to shake him up, throw cold water on his face. But the cure is as often chiefly preventative toward people not to let go of conscious awareness, of the I awareness all the time. It is not necessary at all. One can have the highest state of consciousness, keeping alert, never any reason to give up the precious gift, hardly developed through inclinations of self-awareness. There is a very fine phrase, Sanskrit, which brings this clearly. Sat Chit Ananda. Sat is truth, the ultimate reality, the universal, the transcendent. Chit is mental awareness of it. And the result is Ananda, bliss. You cannot have bliss if you are not aware of it. So remember and use it for yourself. Sat Chit Ananda, blissful awareness of reality. But awareness, self-conscious awareness, that disposes of all those temptations of losing oneself in the whole and the drop in the sea and all that. These are quite misleading expressions. In my forthcoming book, I deal much more with this, of the fusion of individual and universal consciousness. Innate qualities. Question. As to those qualities coming from the higher unconscious and the self, can one really speak of innate qualities as Maslow does? I think they originate from the soul. So is it only for didactic purposes that it is good to consider them as innate? Answer. It's a difficult point, but there are qualities which can be called innate on the personality level coming from the three sources, and the percentages vary at different stages, and there is no rule. In some cases, one kind of influence prevails, in some cases others, and therefore that is an example of abstract questions, theoretical questions that lead nowhere. It has no meaning to us. Which is more important, the general surroundings, or the influences of the family, or the innate constitution of the individual, or the inheritance from the past experiences? The only practical and helpful thing is to try to ascertain as much as possible through analysis or the study of oneself or others, which at a certain moment may be prevailing, and which combinations of vicious or virtuous circles they produce. But in each case, the combination is different, the percentage is different, and the effects are different. I could add only that clinical facts prove that the individual constitution is often much more important than family conditions and social conditions. The higher self is pure being. Question. In the diagram of the human being, the higher self is not the superego, a construct, and it is also not any phenomenological concept of the self. Instead, it is pure being, essence, not an intellectual construction. This is correct? Can the fact of the transpersonal self be proven scientifically? I mean, as an entity, not in the Jungian sense. Is it by presenting exercises through which individuals can subjectively realize the self, and then let their testimonials speak, or do you expect also a more objective proof to become possible? Answer. Well, this is absolutely quite correct. The higher self is pure being and essence, not an intellectual construction. We'll have to stick to that. You ask how it can be proven scientifically. It all depends what you consider science. By ordinary science, it cannot be proven because there is no proof on that conceptual level. But if you take the scientific attitude and method in the way I have put it, then yes, it is proven by its direct experience. It is one of those primary experiences which are the evidences of themselves. Just as color, a sense of beauty, or other, they need no explanation. They are primary experiences, and therefore have full scientific value in the broader sense. The point is that one has to create the conditions needed for having the experience, and scientists up to now have not taken the trouble to do that. It should be the ABC of the scientific method. You see, the pattern is, let us take a hypothesis, and then let us see if the facts corroborate it or not. If we have only sense enough to make the hypothesis that the self exists, then the next step would be to make the relevant experiments to see if it is there or not. Only those experiments cannot be made in the laboratory with quantitative methods. In a sense, they are difficult. For example, the exercise of disidentification and making room for the experience of identification. The exercise exists and is a definite one. Only we should take the trouble to do it. Here it is a strange blindness. Well, not strange. It can be explained, but there's no use. The only answer is that there are hundreds of thousands of people of every kind and continent who have had this experience and have proclaimed it and given testimonial of that, of course in an indirect way, because it is in itself ineffable. So it is worth hard trying if it is true. Nothing else to say. Either you experiment or lay the subject aside. There cannot be any objective proof because it would be a contradiction in terms. Therefore, it would be useless to make an attempt to appease them. It wouldn't work. Question. So, the self is radiant, the immovable mover? How can the self be immovable if in meditation we say we raise the center of consciousness to its highest level? I say self, meaning small s here. Did Aristotle speak of the self with a capital S here? Dr. Assagioli says they are all one. I can see that in my mind, but find another part differentiating them. Self, or higher self, both seem to move in the physical sense. The one up and the other down and up. I like the idea of an elastic string connecting them. How then is the self immovable? It's a paradox. Or is there a different meaning of immovable? immovable meaning perhaps undeviating centrality, undeviating in motivating movement in other bodies, those of the personality, undeviating in radiance, undeviating in purpose, but seemingly not movable in the physical sense. The self radiates all the time. It's a constant source of radiation and energy. It is not always, though, through the personality. Sometimes the personality seems more important than the inner radiation. So the self is not seen or is not apparent. On the other hand, though, the self can be seen reflected in the unfolding personality. What a paradox and a muddle. Answer: that is good. You have courageously faced the most difficult problem concerning the self and reality in general. Courageously. And you have brought out vividly all the apparent contradictions and paradoxes. And it's good to realize that before going to solutions. Sometimes we have the illusion that we understand this mystery. It is good that you realize you are confused and baffled. It is a very necessary and useful stage, and I think others may be too. Well, it is a problem that has intrigued for ages human beings, also in the East. Just this morning I happened to go through 3 Upanishads in which this problem is taken up. So you see that it has degrees of nobility. Thank you for bringing up our questions. I don't remember who said in a humorous way that the most difficult word to use is the word I. And another said, try to keep track of how many times during the day you say I. Every time we feel the temptation to say I, let us rather say within me. And this can be expressed in purely psychological terms. The self and the feminine aspect. Among the many misunderstandings about women and woman and the woman's function is that the woman's function is something passive, that man is dominant and woman passive. This is completely mistaken. The whole process of liberation, gestation, is a most active and positive function. The old Hindus had seen that very well, and in their symbolic mythology they said that each male deity had his feminine counterpart, the Shaktis. Shiva had his Shakti, and other gods had their respective Shaktis. Well, Shakti means energy. So you see how it is a completely different conception. In manifestation, the active part, the creative part, is accomplished by woman. In a broad sense, it could be compared with the self and superconscious activities. The self is either the neutral or masculine entity, but all the processes going on in the superconscious belong to the creative Shakti aspect. In the Tibetan mysticism, woman counterparts of the deity are called Dakini. So all their correspondences are the matrix, the uterus, in which the creative process is performed until the moment of birth. And the house is, of course, the feminine aspect where man goes back as a haven of refuge and recuperation. Well, this is the idea, of course. But it should be so, and these are 2 points, the Cancer and the ecology, and Cancer and the feminine function in nature, in humanity, and cosmically. Cancer is a sign of incarnation, and without incarnation, no evolution or manifestation is possible. Question: is the feminine type of action more the inner action? Answer: no, both outer and inner, from the physical up to and including the superconscious creative activity and through at all levels. I suggest you use more and more consistently the namaskara, the salutation. That is, to salute each other's self or soul. In a sense, it is a practical application of the self project. Salute the self, the soul, in each and all. To some it can be done aloud, mutually. To others you can do it silently, with the blessing intention. So perhaps at the beginning of any group meeting, suggest 2 minutes silence, and you, in those minutes of silence, give this blessing, namaskara. That creates the atmosphere. Another suggestion, not a new one, I repeat what I have said another time. Use the constant exercise of translation. That is, translate the inner teaching into exoteric terms. This you can do individually, and in the group you can take up that. You may gradually prepare a manual and a dictionary. I think you'll need 3 to 4 years' time. Let us begin at once. Soul is the same as self. Spiritual is the same as transpersonal. And now, concentration. The physical relaxation we have had. I think emotional serenity you have. The mental point is more difficult, but let's achieve a little of it, just what is needed. It is helpful to repeat silently the right word at each stage, and this is the word silence. So let each of us say to oneself silently, silence of the mind, stillness of the mind, silence, silence. Then a rapid elevation on the wings of aspiration and projecting all the attention and the mental interest acquired to the transpersonal, to the superconscious, towards the self. Let's affirm our deep conviction that we are the self, the radiant self, and the joyous communion of the souls, of the selves, part of the one soul of the universal self. Let us stop a moment on that which is the peak of the meditation. Now, 2 minutes of receptive meditation. Opening ourselves with faith, joy, and gratitude to the downpouring of the higher energies. Now let us bring down gradually, deliberately, with great awareness, these energies into the mind as sight, into the heart as love, into the body as livingness, and finally the radiation. Let us radiate all the energy through the blessing. Just imagine the globe of the earth and say, love to all beings, north, south, east, west, above, below. Love to all beings. Compassion to all beings, north, south, east, west, above, below. Compassion to all beings. Joy to all beings, north, south, east, west, above, below. Joy to all beings. Serenity to all beings, north, south, east, west, above, below. Serenity to all beings. So let it be, and help us to do always better, and always more our part in both inner and outer service. Good. Thank you for listening to Readings from Roberto, and we hope you will tune in to our next reading. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to share the wisdom.